My name is Ron Halber. I'm the Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, and I want to thank the Jewish Federation of Greater Washington for co-sponsoring tonight's call, and my gratitude to the over 500 of you who have joined us here. Following yesterday's Iranian attack on Israel, we are all trying to get a better understanding of its ramifications, and to do so, we are honored to have to be joined by Ambassador Dennis Ross, a frequent visitor to the JCRC. Ambassador Ross is the counselor, and William David's a distinguished fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. For those of you out of town, that's a very prominent think tank here in Washington. He has served under Presidents Bush, Clinton, and Obama, where his elite played a leading role in shaping U.S. Middle East policy. And he was instrumental, the ambassador, in helping Israelis and Palestinians reach the 1995 interim agreement, brokering the 1997 Hebron Accords, and facilitating the 1994 Israel's Jordanian peace treaty. Simply, he is one of America's most prominent respected Middle East analysts. We're grateful that the ambassador has joined us here today to share his observations. Following the ambassador's presentations, we'll take some questions followed through the Q&A feature, and we'll try to get as many as possible. The closed caption available is at the bottom of your screen. Ambassador, the floor is yours.
All right. So I will, look, since this has just happened yesterday and we're still probably in an evolving situation, let me give you a little bit of background, then describe what the Iranians did, go through what I think the Israelis are now debating, and give you a sense of what I think two sides of the argument are. And I'll wrap it up there because I don't know what they're going to do either. I can tell you what I think the inputs are, but I think there's some dilemmas here, and I'll go over that as well. And then we'll open up to your questions. All right, so the first thing is, on April 1st, Israel took out a leading member of the Revolutionary Guard of the Quds forces. The Israelis, interesting enough, referred to him as Hassan Madan, and you'll see in the press frequently that he's that they portray him by a different name, which is basically Reza Zahidi. It's the same person. Now, the significance of this guy and the other people who they killed, and you'll hear it said that the Israelis struck a consulate. They actually struck the residence next to the consulate. The Iranians are crying foul over the idea that the Israelis struck some kind of diplomatic building, entity, which I have to admit has a pretty strong ring of irony, since when we talk about the Iranians, we have the seizure of the American embassy and hostages. We have the Iranians allowing a mob to burn the Saudi consulate within Tehran. We have the Iranians at one time seizing the British embassy in Iran. So it's quite interesting for them to talk about the sanctity of diplomatic residences or buildings, because they've never, in fact, respected those. But let's put that to the side. Who the Israelis took out was a leading member of the Quds forces who was responsible for the close coordination with Nasrallah and everything that Hezbollah has done vis-a-vis Israel, certainly since October 7th, when they began firing into Israel on October 8th. He is, if you read the story in the New York Times about all the weapons being smuggled into the West Bank that the Iranians are responsible for, he's the guy. He's the guy who organized that. He's the guy who carried it out. He is the guy who works very closely with all the Shia militias in Iraq and Syria. So it's no doubt that the Israelis saw this as a target of opportunity. One could say, look, given everything else going on with Gaza and with the risk of escalation in the north, why would Israel do this as well at this point? And my guess is partly because it was a target of opportunity. This is not someone like Soleimani, Hassan Soleimani, who the Trump administration assassinated, who kept a very high profile, was responsible for building all of these militias. The militias have become a kind of Iranian foreign legion, this is a guy who is probably the most important person after Soleimani. Now, I mentioned Soleimani not only because of the relationship between him and Madani, but I mention it because what's very interesting here, the Iranians immediately said after the killing of Madani and 6 others who were with him, his deputies, basically key, I think, his key subordinates, right after this, they were outraged and they said they were going to retaliate. A couple weeks before, the Israelis also were able to kill in Damascus another senior member of the Quds forces. The Iranians didn't respond to that, but they did respond to this. And they said Israel would pay for this. And over the course of what was, almost 2 weeks, they were raising the level of the threats they were making. In the course of the last 5 days, it was clear that they were sending messages to the U.S., making it clear they were going to respond in a big way. Now, you might ask yourself the question, why would they do that? Why would they be communicating? It was actually through the Omanis. Why would they be communicating with the U.S. to let them know that they were going to carry out a big response to what the Israelis did? And this is the reason I mentioned Soleimani. Before the Iranians attacked the al-Assad base, where we had a presence, a military presence, they let the Iraqi prime minister, the Iraqi government know they were going to do it, the site they were going to hit, knowing that they would then communicate it to us. So they were giving us a forewarning so we would be prepared. They could make a statement by hitting the base. We could be prepared to minimize the damage and to the base, but also to the risk to the forces we had there. We were aware of this, although we didn't take as many precautions as we should have. We didn't lose anybody, but we did have 32 people, 32 soldiers, who were hit by a barrage. They were in hardened places, but the barrage was heavy, and 32 suffered severe concussions. Nobody died, and Trump made the decision, because nobody died, not to retaliate to what the Iranians had done. The Iranians were sending the message because they wanted to make it clear they were going to act, but they also were sending, in their own way, a message that said, we don't want to turn this into a war. This was their way of signaling. This was their way of messaging. Now, fast forward to what they've done basically over the last week. Something very similar. Now, they said they were going to respond in a big way. I know that the administration was informing Arab leaders that Iran was saying we would respond in a big way. We were saying, we were, in a sense, telling them not to do it. We were urging others to do the same with them. I don't think we threatened them ourselves, although I suspect that we said, if you do something that gets out of hand, you could easily draw us in. The Iranians were trying to limit this while still at the same time carrying out what was a significant assault on Israel. Israel had at least 5 days to prepare the ground for this. The message, by the way, that they were conveying was they would hit military targets in Israel. Here again, signaling what they were going after, that they were not going after urban targets. Now, I think the size of the attack yesterday, where you're basically 185 drones, 110 missiles, surface-to-surface missiles, and 30 cruise missiles. Now, each of these, just so you know, the drones take 5 to 6 hours to get there. The cruise missiles take on the order of an hour to 2 hours. The missiles take 10 minutes. They did try to coordinate this. So this was, the size of this being over 300 was obviously designed to inflict some damage, though they were trying to do it in a way that would limit the character of it so it wouldn't produce an all-out war. The one thing about the Iranians, and I have a new book that I'm just finishing up on. I have one of the chapters is a long chapter on Iran, and I go through the pattern since the emergence of the Islamic Republic in 1979. When it comes to direct conflicts, they are very leery of getting into direct conflicts. They're quite willing to fight to the last of their proxies, with the exception of Hezbollah. the last of their proxies, meaning Hamas. They were never going to sacrifice Hezbollah to save Hamas. They'll fight to the last of all their Shia proxies in Iraq. Kataib Hezbollah, Asayb al-Haq, Hamas, Islamic Jihad in Gaza, but not Hezbollah. You might ask, why not Hezbollah? First of all, Hezbollah were the shock troops for them in Syria. They committed very few Iranian forces. There were some there. At one time, they probably had about 1,000, but they were never the fighters on the ground. They were there in an advisory role. Hezbollah actually committed the shock forces, the people who carried out the assaults. If you look at places where the fighting was quite severe, as in places like Aleppo, it was Hezbollah that were the assault troops on the ground, not the Iranians. Nasrallah, you had Soleimani going after to claim victory, but he wasn't there until Hezbollah basically, with Russian bombers from the air, produced the outcome after several months. So Hezbollah plays a different role, partly because it's the shock forces for them, partly because they're the ones who train all these Arab militias. Think about it. The current head of the Quds forces, Ismail Qani, doesn't speak Arabic. Soleimani did. The Madani, not of blessed memory, he did. But Hezbollah, they're all Arabic speakers. So most of the training that is done by Hezbollah. So they're the trainers, they're the fighters, they're the ones who basically oftentimes are the advisors with these militias. They built up the Hamas military industrial base, and they're the ones who have 150,000 rockets, which Iran is viewed as the deterrent against Israel striking their nuclear infrastructure. So Hezbollah is simply too important to them, not to mention Hezbollah represents the only group where the Iranians were successfully able to export the Islamic Revolution. So all these factors put Hezbollah in a different category than the other proxies. So here we are. They carry out the strike they did. They crossed the threshold, given the numbers, given the fact that these were direct assaults from Iran. By the way, not all the 300 were from Iran. There were some fired from Iraq. There were some missiles fired from the Houthis in the Yemen. But the vast majority were launched from Iran. Okay, Israel, there's an interesting combination here. Israel was prepared. Its air and missile defenses were quite simply superb. But they weren't alone. The U.S. intercepted cruise missiles and the drones. We had F-15s which shot down cruise missiles. The British made some contributions. We probably were responsible for destroying 1/4 of what was fired at Israel. The Jordanians, because this was overflying Jordan, the Jordanians shot down at least 5, including one of the air defense groups that was responsible included a daughter of King Abdullah. So this was a coalition in action. We often talk, and Israel often says, we will defend ourselves by ourselves. Not this time. They relied on the support and the active intervention of others. It doesn't detract from how well the Israelis operated, but is a reminder that the notion that Israel can do all this by itself, when its own military is saying they're facing 7 fronts. They've never faced this before. And the sophistication of what they're facing, they require a coalition to make this manageable. And one of the things clearly that President Biden was communicating to Bibi Netanyahu was, look, we're here actively helping you. American forces are intercepting the threat against you. So if you're going to go and retaliate, especially when we have forces in the area and we could be targeted, you have an obligation to us. You talk to us before you take any decisions. And it's pretty clear that the administration prefers the Israelis at this point not to retaliate militarily. The Iranians are saying it's over if the Israelis don't retaliate. That could be all bluff, but it's clear the administration would prefer to act diplomatically at this point. All right, what are the considerations on the Israeli side? Some of them mirror what I experienced back in 1991 when Saddam Hussein launched Scud missiles against Israel after we had begun the war against Iraq. The Bush administration and the Secretary of State, Jim Baker, basically said to the Prime Minister of Israel, Yitzhak Shamir, you tell us what targets you want to hit, don't you strike back. Now, the reason we were saying that is even though we had commitments earlier, previously, because we had worked these out in November, the war starts January 16th, we had commitments from all the Arab participants in the coalition not to pull out of the coalition if Israel was hit first and Israel retaliated. But when the initial Scuds were fired against Israel and Israel wanted to retaliate, Saudi Arabia said Israel can't overfly Saudi Arabia to attack Iraq. And Jordan said if they try to overfly us, we will resist it. And the position of the administration was, you, Israel, do not want to take what is the world against Saddam and play into his hands, which is to turn this into an Arab-Israeli conflict. That is not in your interest. And Shamir agreed, even though he was under tremendous pressure from the IDF and tremendous pressure from his Minister of Defense, Moshe Aarons. And the reason he was under tremendous pressure is relevant now. Israel's traditional deterrent has rested on the following. You hit us and we lose a hangnail, you lose an arm when we retaliate. The fear has always been we cannot be put in a position where anyone can pressure us into not retaliating when we've been hit. This was exactly the argument in 1991. And Shamir withstood it. Because then the one issue that's different, and it's not a small difference. In 1991, we were saying to Shamir, you tell us what targets you would hit in Iraq and we will hit them for you. We have more forces than you can bring to bear. We'll do it. So you tell us what we need to hit and we'll do it. When that's not what's being offered right now. But what is being raised is the issue that, the fact is you had a significant coalition helping you last night. And for you to act as if you didn't have it, as if you're going to go on your own, that undercuts the potential for you to have this kind of an ongoing coalition. So the debate within Israel reflects some of what I was describing from 1991. We have been hit. We've been hit in an unprecedented way by Iran. And the head of the Iranian military said that the ground rules have changed. And this could be a precedent for the future. So the impulse within Israel on the part of some, certainly on the part of people like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but not only them, is that we need to hit back hard. Now, the question is, maybe if you didn't have a war in Gaza, what's different at the time of Iraq, Israel wasn't facing any threats. It wasn't in another war. That's different. The flip side is the U.S. was actively prepared to go ahead and attack targets in Iraq, and we're not prepared to do that in Iran now, but Israel wasn't in the middle of a war in Gaza. And by a war in Gaza where they're succeeding tactically, but not strategically. So at a time when the image of Israel internationally has clearly been damaged by the images coming out of Gaza, the idea that Israel would just ignore the rest of the world, number one, ignore the U.S., and in a context where Israel succeeded in intercepting, with our support, 99% of everything that was fired at them. The only casualty was an 11-year-old Bedouin girl who was hit by shrapnel from one of the Iron Domes. That's the only casualty. She's seriously injured. She's in the hospital. There were some people who were treated for shock, but that was it. I mean, I think the distinction here is if Israel had suffered real casualties and fatalities in serious numbers, if their bases had suffered damage, they had one air base that suffered very minor damage. That was it. So the argument within Israel against responding, and it's being made by serious people, very serious people, is we blunted this. B, we didn't do it alone. C, our image in the world right now is maybe being countered by the fact that everyone is reminded that a lot of what's going on is all the result of Iran. Do we really want to take the focus off of Iran? We have the Biden administration, the president organizing the G7, not only to condemn it politically, but I think to impose new sanctions on Iran. So do we want to, at that point, when suddenly we've been seen as the victimizer in Gaza, now maybe the image is shifting a little bit unless we lose this moment. That's the argument that's basically being made against. Now, it's also, I can tell you, if you look at what Benny Gantz is saying publicly, his response is, we will respond at a time and place and in a manner of our own choosing. That's a very good formula. If I were advising the Israelis, I would say, let's make the Iranians sweat. You know, today they have got gas lines all over the country. Fine, play on that. Make it clear. You'll respond at a time of your choosing and in a manner of your choosing. That's point one. Point two, personally, I would let them wait a little while, be nervous about the other shoe falling. I would personally carry out a significant cyber attack in Iran in a way that would highlight for the Iranian leadership what they're losing. Israel can shut down the country. Let them deal with the consequences of that. Israel doesn't have to say a thing. Everyone will know, and the Iranians will know, you do this, you pay a big price. Maybe somewhere down the line, the fact Israel's done this before, they can take out some of the facilities. They've attacked centrifuge facilities, some of the bases. They could go at the bases where the cruise missiles and drones were launched. So, but I would wait to do that, and I might even do it covertly. I might not even admit it. I would wait a while, and I would keep the Iranians guessing and nervous. They did a little bit of that towards the Israelis over the last 12 days. But I think, this is an issue that is being debated now, and I'm not sure what the Israelis will decide. The fact that Bibi before, in the last phone call with Biden, he responded after the killing of the 7 aid workers who were killed as part of the convoy of the World Central Kitchen. Bibi very quickly responded to a set of demands that Biden had on dramatically increasing the humanitarian assistance going into Gaza. By the way, the steps that Israel took were steps they could have taken months ago. In my own view, they probably should have, because the image they needed to create was that this was about destroying Hamas's ability ever to threaten Israel again. It was not about punishing Palestinians. Because of the way they approached the humanitarian issue, the image that was created internationally, it was about punishing Palestinians, not only about going after Hamas. So there's a chance right now for Israel to kind of seize the high ground, take advantage of their success. And the truth is the failure of Iran. This was a failure of Iran. One other thing I hope that we will push, they were firing at Jerusalem. Now, I don't know if they were firing at, the Hamas, but the risk of, if you're firing ballistic missiles at Jerusalem, of hitting the third most holy sites in Islam, it seems to me that's a very reckless act that shows the Iranians care very little about what is important historically, emblematically, symbolically, religiously to Muslims. I would play that up as well. Okay, I think I went through some of the dilemmas and where we are, so why don't I stop there, and I'm happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Ambassador. One of the questions, I'm trying to roll a bunch of these questions together, is this going to limit Israel's freedom of action in terms of being able to assassinate other targets of opportunity? Will Israel feel they can't go ahead and take out Iranian generals in Syria and Lebanon because they feel it could provoke a missile reaction? And if so, does that undermine Israeli deterrence?
I'm not so sure that killing these generals has ever enhanced Israeli deterrence. I think what it does is it complicates Iran's planning. It complicates their operations. It requires replacements. Khani, who replaced Soleimani, is not nearly as effective as Soleimani was. I think it affects Iran's ability to operate. Maybe it makes their generals somewhat more cautious the way they operate. I'm not sure it has materially affected their deterrence of Iran. Having said that, I think it's probably pretty clear that the next time Israel goes after these kinds of figures, they'll probably have more of a debate about the pros and cons of doing it. What are the benefits from getting it? Are they getting enough benefit in terms of really disrupting Iran's ability to operate and threaten them? Or is this kind of a target of opportunity with someone who can easily be replaced without much of an effect? Then you sort of say, are we getting enough to justify that this could be the response? But honestly, that probably should have been the discussion before even this. How are you really materially benefiting from this? The argument that it never makes sense to us, I don't buy that either. When they took out Fakhrizadeh, who was the chief nuclear, the driver of the Iranian nuclear program, that disrupted it. I mean, you have to look at who you're going after, and you have to decide, are you really gaining something significant? There are times when they've carried out these targeted killings where it has sent a message. They killed others of the Iranian nuclear scientists. Well, one of the effects that had was there were a lot of Iranian nuclear scientists who weren't too keen to be working on the nuclear program. So my point is, you have to evaluate this. It's not a broad principle one way or the other. You have a hierarchy of objectives. You have a set of priorities. You have to weigh what you're doing against how this fits achieving your objectives. And I said it should have been true before. It should definitely be true going forward. And there'll be times when it will be worth the risk, and other times when you'll say it's not worth the risk.
Can you explain a little bit on Jordanian military cooperation in this, in the defense of Israel, or the defense of their own skies?
It was defense of their own. They'll say it's defense of their own skies because they didn't know that something would drop. There was a residential neighborhood that was actually hit, although I think it may have been because of their interception of the missile. They're part of Central Command. Israel's part of Central Command. General Kurilla was in Israel this whole week. What Central Command has been creating, and people are unaware of it because they don't broadcast it because there's no need to, there is a common set of early warnings. Everybody has consoles. The military, they're all connected. They get an early warning, pops up, they're all connected to this. You have something overflying Jordan. Are you completely confident it's not going to hit in Jordan? And Jordan's point will be, we protect our own airspace. So, they will be attacked by some who will say, you were protecting Israel. You shouldn't be protecting Israel. And Jordan can define what's in its own national security interests and doesn't need the help of those who will attack it, who basically are prepared to defend Iran. Again, we've been reminded, Iran is the driver of I would say, the lion's share of instability in the region. Iran is responsible for trying to exploit every conflict in the region. So should Iran pay a price? The answer is absolutely.
Do you think that Israel will succeed? How long do you think Israel can leverage this diplomatic this positive diplomatic attitude toward it, and how can that help it in its current situation in Gaza?
Look, what it needs to do in Gaza, and I've been saying this for some time, what it needs to do in Gaza is define an achievable objective. Stop the talk, total military victory. It means, actually, they don't say total. Bibi says total victory. So you're going to have a total victory, but as soon as you pull out of the north, you have to go back into Al-Shifa Hospital because there's 1,000 Hamas that are in the hospital. That doesn't look like a total victory. It looks like you are succeeding militarily. So my objective, which is the right objective for Israel because they're achieving it. They have basically destroyed 19 of 24 battalions. So there's 5 battalions left, 4 are in Rafah. That means you have already defeated Hamas as a military. It's no longer military. It's gone back to what it was. It's a militia again. But a militia is a totally different threat than a military. And a militia that has no command control, that has lost basically all of its commanders and deputy commanders, that no longer has any organized units. It's no longer a military. It doesn't mean they disappear, but it means their ability, first of all, to control Gaza is significantly lessened. It means you still have to act in a way to, when they crop up, to take more limited attacks. It means you end up treating Gaza the way you treat the West Bank now. The difference is in the West Bank, you have the PA. And what generally is not known right now, the PA has been acting in the West Bank outside of the refugee camps. They're not acting in the refugee camps in Jenin. They're not acting in the refugee camps in Nablus. There are places where they won't go in, but they're acting in other places. You don't have the equivalent of that. One of the things that's necessary, you can't leave a vacuum in Gaza, because that allows either the remnants of Hamas to reemerge, or it allows others who are likely to be extreme to emerge. So you need a Palestinian alternative. Because of Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are against the PA going back, Israel, the prime minister is saying, we don't want, the PA back. The truth is they're going to accept the PA being back because the PA should come back, but the PA can't come back as it is now. It has to be reformed. It has to be transformed so it has credibility. It has no credibility in the West Bank right now.
But a lot of people also believe the ambassador that the Palestinian Authority can't be reconstituted, that it's too plagued with corruption. So how do you get to a Palestinian Authority 2.0?
We have the experience of when it was done before. In 2007, after the Fatah and the PA had lost Gaza, so they lost legitimacy, and there was complete lawlessness in the West Bank. Every city was controlled by gangs. The Bush administration mobilized all the donors, went to Abu Mazen and said, you will empower Salam Fayyad as the prime minister, get out of his way, let him make decisions. He went in, professionalized the security. Everybody thought he was going to go in to redo the economy. He said, we don't have an economy if we don't have security. He professionalized the security forces. He himself went to the site of scenes where they took people on. He was there literally to give directive. They reestablished law and order. They did a deal with Israel so that those who were most wanted, the Israelis said, okay, we won't go after them if you'll put them in jail, and he did. And he then created a transparent budgeting process, cleaned the place up. He was there for 5 years. Our mistake at the end was Abu Mazen was jealous of him. Fatah was resenting him because he didn't appoint people based on patronage. He cleaned the place up. Eventually, he got fired by Abu Mazen. We were absent. We should have gone and said, you fire him, we cut you off. We didn't do that. And the Biden administration needs to be much tougher on this issue of reform. If there's reform, you'll allow in 12 to 18 months for the PA to go back. And if there's reform, you will get Arabs to go in on the ground with forces. They will not go in on the ground with forces to be during this intervening transition period if they think there's no transition period, because there's no alternative to Hamas. They will be there as a bridge, but they won't be a bridge to nothing. So this is in Israel's interest. Now, Israel can't, it's not up to Israel to get the PA reform. It requires us to mobilize the world again to insist on it.
What options are there for Israeli, Saudi Arabian rapprochement?
One of the reasons the administration is so anxious to produce a ceasefire, even if it's a 45-day ceasefire and it's part of a phased approach, and maybe you don't get beyond phase 1. But that 45-day ceasefire is basically a hostage deal. It's not a ceasefire. It's not a ceasefire without a hostage deal. It's a hostage deal that produces a ceasefire. And in 45 days, basically 40 to 45 hostages get released. But that 45-day period allows you to do several things from the administration standpoint. One, it allows you to set up a structure, not only to ensure humanitarian assistance is going in, but the ability to absorb it and provide security for its distribution. So you solve the humanitarian issue. In addition, if there's a complete ceasefire, the administration, I think its game plan is to finalize with Saudi Arabia, right, here's the deal. Here's the bilateral part of this defense treaty with us. You get a nuclear industry partnership with us, and you tell us what you require in the Palestinian issue to be able to close the normalization deal. We go to Prime Minister Netanyahu. We say, here's the deal. You choose. Now, it's a deal by definition. Smotrich and Ben-Gvir will reject. Bibi is in a position where, today his legacy is October 7th, or his legacy potentially could be a transformative deal, normalization with Saudi Arabia, and a kind of cementing of the coalition we saw in action yesterday. By the way, some of what was shot down were flights over Saudi Arabia. They didn't shoot anybody down, but they certainly let us do it.
If Israel were to attack, were to retaliate, what format do you think it would take?
I think the most likely would be they would target. They wouldn't hit urban sites either. They would target military bases, probably the military bases where drones are largely stored and launched. Or they might hit in the middle of the night a kind of drone assembly facility or a centrifuge assembly facility, or they might hit, again, a ballistic missile base. The interesting thing is they could do these things in covert means. They don't necessarily have to do it overtly. But the kind of targets I just mentioned, those are the targets they would hit.
Do you think they would take advantage of such a situation to target the nuclear sites that they've been?
Well, if they did that, then they have an all-out war with Iran. And that means 150,000 rockets from Hezbollah.
What's their capacity to shoot daily of those 150,000 rockets? How many do we know they can get off?
3,000 to 4,000 a day.
And does Israel have the capability to militarily destroy those launchers?
No. It has to go in on the ground. It would take them, you're talking 3 to 4 weeks. Israel would be completely shut down for at least a month. Everybody in Israel would be living in bomb shelters for at least that time.
So
Ben Gurion would be closed.
What would be closed? I'm sorry?
Ben Gurion would be closed.
So the only way to eliminate that is from the ground, not the air.
You can affect some of it from the air. Look, Israel would be in a much better position to do this when it has the Iron Beam up and running. It doesn't have that yet. The problem with Israel has this integrated missile defense network, air and missile defense network that worked very well yesterday. But the numbers were 300. They were given a lot of warning. They prepared, everything was in place. This would be 3,000. Every Iron Dome missile, every Arrow missile is 10 to 20 times as expensive as the missiles that are being fired at Israel. It can be quickly saturated. The system can be quickly saturated. When they have the Iron Beam, can't saturate it. And the costs are already sunk. There's no cost. Now Israel has to replenish what they expended yesterday. Once they get the Iron Beam, it doesn't stand alone, but as part of this overall network and system, it changes. It's a game changer in terms of its ability to handle the missiles coming from Hezbollah. But Hezbollah would do a barrage that's dramatically larger than anything we've seen. 3 to 4,000 rockets at a time. They have at least 75,000 rockets that can cover all of Israel with heavy payloads.
Can you explain to everybody what Iron Beam is?
Iron Beam is it's a directed energy laser. So it shoots a laser at a missile and destroys it by destroying the command and control. In some cases, burning the missile up, but mostly destroying the missile, so it has no guidance any longer.
Any idea how far we are away from Israel being able to deploy that?
I think a year.
And that could significantly alter Hezbollah's ability to impact to harm Israel.
It changes the character of this. Now, look, I'm not saying the fact that Israel can't move 80,000 people back to the north is unacceptable. Now, almost Hochstein is trying to negotiate a deal where Hezbollah basically will have no forces near the border, no longer in a position where they could launch an attack unannounced, and no longer in a position where it can use, for example, anti-tank missiles to attack the villages that are along the border. So until such a deal is cut, you're not going to get people moving back to the north.
What do you think the Iranian people think about this, about the claims of victory from their leadership from firing 300 missiles, although 99% were shot down? To them, is this a great victory, or to them or do you think or does this just feed additional Iranian discontent?
First of all, the vast majority of the Iranian public doesn't believe a word the Iranian leadership says.
Okay.
You have to understand that this is a public that is completely alienated. Every year since 2017, prior to the killing of Mahsa Amini, the Kurdish 21-year-old woman who was brutally beaten and killed as a result of, not by the morality police, because she wasn't wearing her hijab appropriately. Every year since 2017, the regime has, it cut subsidies on dairy and eggs, and it produced riots in 21 cities. It cut back the subsidy on the next year on the issue of oil. There were demonstrations over the shortages of water. This is a country that before the end of this decade, will not have the water resources to sustain more than half of its current population. The alienation of the Iranian public is deep. The turnout, after a major effort to emphasize the importance of turnout for their elections on March 1, they had the lowest turnout ever. This is a passive opposition. And when you boycott an election, when the extreme leader is giving all these exhortation speeches saying, this is part of our national security, and they didn't turn out to vote. In Tehran, the estimate was 11% voted. So the idea, this is a public that is already alienated. They don't buy, what Supreme Leader is saying. They don't buy that they should be involved in these external wars. Where's the development within Iran? 40% inflation.
So so would you think they believe the spending of money on these proxies is a waste of their national treasure?
I think so. But nothing. Look, they coerce the public, and nothing is going to change before the Supreme Leader dies. In authoritarian systems, when there's a succession, this is always a period of stress for them. When he dies, but who knows? He's 85, has prostate cancer. But I can tell you, when I first went into the government and Khomeini was still there, and I would read all the list of maladies he had, there wasn't anything he didn't suffer from, and he lived another 10 years. So, it must be the yogurt.
Well, right now, do you think the security people in the national security establishment in the United States are telling Biden to do in the event Israel does go ahead and launch an offensive operation?
I think we're trying to persuade the Israelis. If Israel, let's say Bibi comes back and says, look, we have to do something. We have to do something. So let's agree on what we can do. I can imagine some scenarios where the administration would say, okay, the following kinds of steps, we can live with.
So what you're describing is actually the possibility that this latest operation, the latest military assault by Iran on Israel, could actually help reduce tensions between Biden and Bibi if done properly. This could actually bring them together by showing how Israel has a lot, and the United States has invested a lot in Israel's defense, and that could actually give Israel, the United States, actually some more leverage over what's going on in Gaza in the Security Cabinet.
Think about the following. We move forces around the region. We added forces in the region. We moved forces around the region. We added to the presence we had in different bases. And then we went ahead and we intercepted a quarter of what they were sending towards Israel. You know, you can, as I say, when we help you, then you don't, the idea that you ignore our advice completely, yes, you're a sovereign country. Yes, you are. But we also have forces in the region. So when you do these things, you also are exposing American forces. At a minimum, you have to tell us so we can position our own forces differently to reduce any risk to them.
Given the prime minister's political woes, is he do you think he's more likely than not to go ahead and to respond, or to go ahead and to accede to Biden's request for to not retaliate?
I think it depends on how seriously he takes the threats of Ben-Gvir to pull out of the coalition if there isn't a tough enough response.
I find it a little hard to understand that the Ben-Gvir, who's to be modest, is an extremist, that his pulling out of the coalition could actually define Israel's military security doctrine in this matter.
Well, I hope that Bibi would choose Biden over Ben-Gvir.
Let me ask you, what's one, and we'll close down with this, Ambassador, what's one unreported stellar observation that's come out of this? One thing that that you think is apparent. One thing that I've come out of is that despite all of Iran's talk and bluntness, and Israel's a one-bomb state, there actually was a calculated professional decision that was made to choreograph this attack in a way to allow them to save face and for Israel to respond. So it actually showed a lot more responsibility and a lot more temperament than a lot of people give the Iranian regime credit for. Do you have like one observation that stands out?
I would qualify that a little bit. They didn't launch 300 because they didn't want some to hit. They did. They wanted to inflict damage on Israel. They did. But they wanted to do it in a way that wouldn't trigger an all-out war.
Right.
That's the problem when you're using forces. That's a hard thing to modulate. It's a hard thing to get just right. But the broader point that if they were really intent on inflicting much greater damage on Israel, they would have done it. There would have been no alerts on this. They wouldn't have sent messages. They wouldn't have spent this time. So they were trying to avoid a larger war, but they wanted to inflict real damage on Israel, at least on the air bases in the south. That was clearly what they were hoping. And what we saw was the contrast in capability. The gap between Israeli and Iranian capability is huge. I was saying this before, there's a built-in asymmetry. Iran will have a hard time penetrating Israel. Israel will have no problem penetrating Iran.
And they know this.
Yes, they know it.
And
there were no sirens in Tel Aviv yesterday.
You would think that in and of itself would be the deterrence. Your final sentence that you just said that there. Israel.
Yeah. I would say, for me, the thing that needs to be recognized is, I made this point, but I want to reinforce it. It's pretty remarkable that there was a coalition here, that Israel was not on its own, and that you had and a coalition that actually engaged in military operations in defense of Israel, largely the U.S., but not only the U.S.
The French, the British, Jordanian.
This is, again, when Israel's facing all these proxies, it needs to be part of a coalition. I think reinforcing this point is an important. It's a reminder that something has changed for the better, notwithstanding everything we're seeing, and that's why it's also in Israel's interest. Take advantage of the moment. Be careful not to squander this moment.
Could be a diplomatic offensive for Israel that could actually help reposition her in the future. Well, thank you, Ambassador, for your exceptional insights and for taking time to be with us this evening. As always, it's great to have you. And to our friends who joined us tonight, please check your email and your email and social media in the coming days for opportunities to demonstrate our support for Israel during these challenging times. And as we like to end these calls, I'm Yisrael Chai. Thank you, everyone.